Is it one?
Hey, Brian, I think we're ready to go. Tell Husham, would you?
The committee will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee not on this subcommittee are authorized to participate in today's hearing. This hearing is entitled "A Future Without Public Housing," examining the Trump administration's efforts to eliminate public housing. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. It is no secret that since taking office, President Trump, along with his chosen operator, Secretary Ben Carson, has been on a mission to end public housing as we know it. This administration has taken decisive steps to get rid of public housing, laying out a blueprint for a future without any. In every single budget request the Trump administration has put out, it has proposed massive spending cuts to programs that allow public housing authorities to address their most pressing capital needs and rehabilitate their housing stock. Thankfully, Congress has largely ignored these requests, but that hasn't stopped this administration from finding other ways to eliminate public housing using the euphemistic term repositioning. This administration is pushing PHAs to eliminate their public housing altogether and replacing it with vouchers or other forms of assistance. Advocates and academics say that public housing cannot and should not be replaced because the benefits of public housing cannot be fully replicated in other forms of assistance. For example, public housing is more likely to be accessible to people with disabilities than apartments that are available to housing choice voucher holders. Additionally, landlord participation in the Housing Choice Voucher Program is generally voluntary, and households with vouchers often face challenges finding landlords who will accept them. However, despite the importance of public housing, funding for the public housing program has decreased significantly over the past few decades. In 2018, funding for the Capital Fund had fallen 36% since the year 2000. While Congress recently increased funding for public housing in fiscal years 2018 and 19, overall funding for the program is still 17% lower than the FY 2010 funding level. As a result of this chronic underfunding, there is an estimated $70 billion backlog in needed capital repairs to fix tenants' homes from substandard and unsafe conditions, and more than 10,000 public housing homes are lost each year due to disrepair. We cannot afford to lose any of these units, given the fact that our country is facing an affordable housing crisis. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, there is a shortage of 7 million homes that are affordable and available to America's poorest families. In my district, Missouri's 1st District, which I represent, there are just 3 affordable homes available for every 10 of the lowest income renter households. Because of this shortage, most of these families are spending over half of their earnings on rent each month. Severe housing cost burdens can have negative consequences for families' physical and mental well-being. These households forego healthy food or delay health care or medications to pay the rent. In the worst cases, they become homeless. That is why I'm working on legislation now to address evictions and stop homelessness, and am pleased to join Chairwoman Waters' Housing as Infrastructure Act of 2019, which would invest a total of $100 billion into our affordable housing infrastructure, including $70 billion for public housing. I'm hopeful that we will learn from this conversation the ways in which we can ensure that America is inspired to reinvest in public housing, one of the best investments in our nation's history. And at this time, I yield back and recognize the ranking member, Mr. Stivers of Ohio.
Thank you, Chairman Clay. I appreciate you calling this hearing today. I think it's important that we explore the challenges confronting our public housing stock, specifically the million units that are directly owned and managed by over 3,000 public housing agencies across the country. A majority of the households served by these folks are elderly or disabled. Many of these individuals are not able to work, and about 38% of them have children. These Americans rely on a federal safety net to keep them off the streets, and members of both sides of the aisle are committed to preserving that safety net. We have thousands of public housing authorities serving a diverse range of communities across the country. Some are well managed, and some are not. But unfortunately, it's clearly been demonstrated that much of the public housing stock is failing HUD's mandate to be decent and safe and sanitary, even to the point of endangering residents. Now that decent and safe standard is the cornerstone of public policy, I should mention that I think that's an incomplete standard. That's because federally assisted housing should be more than about just putting a roof over people's heads. It should be about improving outcomes for residents based on their individual needs and aspirations. The old model concentrated poverty in large, costly buildings that were intentionally isolated from their surrounding communities, and in some cases, kept our neighborhoods even segregated. Residents continue to struggle with that legacy, and we need to ask ourselves, how do we smartly invest in public housings so that we achieve our public policy goals for the future? If you propose to double down on the old model with significant sums of money, I think you'll encounter bipartisan resistance from a lot of members who worry that we won't actually result in better outcomes from that model, because we haven't. A better model would be to prioritize investment in models that work or demonstrate promise. That being said, I do believe we should encourage innovation and innovative ways to finance this transition, from the existing public housing stock, including HUD's current rental assistant demonstration program. In my neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio, the Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority has basically run its entire portfolio of public housing through the RAD program. And now they serve more people. They serve more disabled people. They serve more veterans. They serve more elderly people. And they don't have problems with needs for unmet capital because they've accessed and leveraged private capital. They use HUD as a partner, not HUD as a dependent. They aren't a dependent on HUD anymore, or a sole dependent on HUD. I think it's important to recognize that we have to look at this in a holistic way, and I'm glad we're talking about this. I think this is one part of what we've got to deal with. The memo that the majority put forward for today's hearing made some important points about the flaws of the Housing Choice Voucher Program, namely that in competitive markets, it can take an individual sometimes days before they find a suitable place to live. But that does not disprove that a more market-based model empowers residents to choose a home in a community they want to live with without concentrating poverty. So instead, I think it begs the question of why there's a shortage of properties participating in the housing market in the first place. A shortage of the housing supply is a key contributor to this problem, and that's an issue that our committee is focused on. But there are other, I think, programmatic deficiencies that are keeping quality properties out of the program, and I think it's worth exploring how we can fix that. Like the Mobility Demonstration Act that's championed by my colleague Emmanuel Cleaver, who's the co-chair of the Public Housing Caucus, Lastly, I think it's fitting that one of our witnesses authored a book on public housing reforms in Chicago that was entitled, I believe, No Simple Solutions. There are no simple solutions, and I know that we want to listen to the folks in the field. These are difficult problems that we're trying to solve. They require creative and innovative and collaborative approaches. So I'm looking forward, Mr. Chairman, to hearing from the witnesses today. I appreciate them being here. And for the record, I'd like to submit some testimony from our full committee ranking member, Mr. McHenry.
Without objection,
I yield back.
And I thank the ranking member from Ohio for his comments. At this time, we have been joined by the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Waters, the chairperson of the full committee, who is recognized for a minute. 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've long been an advocate, as you know, for public housing, and I'm so deeply troubled by the actions of the Trump administration to dismantle the program under the direction of Secretary Carson. HUD has made it clear that it wants to eliminate public housing by proposing extreme budget cuts and pushing public housing agencies to convert their units into vouchers. I oppose these efforts and will continue to fight to preserve the homes of public housing residents. That's why I introduced my bill, H.R. 5187, the Housing is Infrastructure Act of 2019, to provide over $100 billion in new funding for affordable housing, including $70 billion to fully address the public housing capital backlog. Let's be clear, affordable housing is infrastructure. As the House moves closer to considering an infrastructure package, we cannot forget America's affordable housing needs. Let me just say, Mr. Chairman, I know that you've worked so much in St. Louis, particularly Wellston, and I know that you've achieved some success in getting, I think, new units there. You know, I'm from St. Louis also, so I know all about Wellston, and I'm very pleased if something positive is going on there. But still, I have problems with the HUD secretary, as you know.
Yeah, and I thank
Yes.
the gentlewoman for her comments, the chairwoman for her comments, and what we were able to achieve in Wellston was because it was a community-wide effort. We had input from stakeholders, from tenants, from advocates of those tenants and local government, as well as with our U.S. Senator Roy Blunt. Because we work together with the local housing authority, with the regional HUD office, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And we were able to get a success story, and we think it could be a way for the nation to move forward in that manner. So thank you for your interest. Okay. At this time, we will welcome the testimony of our witnesses, and today joining us is Ann Gass, Director of Strategic Housing Initiatives, the Housing Authority of the City of Austin. Also, Bobby Collins, Executive Director of the Housing Authority of the City of Shreveport, Louisiana, as well as Susan Popkin, who is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. And we also have Ms. Kate Walz, Vice President of Advocacy, the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. And rounding us out is someone who I'm familiar with, Mr. Eugene Jones, Jr., President and Chief Executive Officer of the Atlanta Housing Authority. Welcome to you all. And let me remind you that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes, and without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. And Ms. Gass, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Proceed.
Chairman Clay, Ranking Member Stivers, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Housing Authority of the City of Austin, also known as HACA. My name is Ann Gass, Director of Strategic Housing Initiatives for HACA. I've been with the agency for almost 20 years and have served in a variety of roles throughout the organization. For the last 4 years, I've served as the Director of Strategic Housing Initiatives, overseeing the conversion to HUD's Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, or RAD. The Housing Authority of the City of Austin has been around as long as public housing. Home to some of the oldest public housing in the country, the first of which were built in the 1930s, HACA has continued to innovate and adapt to maintain and improve 1,839 units of public housing, as well as over 6,000 housing choice and other rental assistance vouchers. Maintaining our housing assets is crucial, as the demand for affordable housing continues to increase. The latest projections are that Austin needs 60,000 units over the next 10 years to keep up with demand. HACA alone has more than 10,000 individuals on our public housing, project-based rental assistance, and housing choice voucher waiting lists. These HUD programs remain at risk, subject to elimination or reduction. The Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, or RAD, seeks to address some of the volatility and history of inadequate funding. Since 2012, HUD has overseen the conversion of almost 130,000 public housing units under this demonstration, which addresses the backlogs of capital needs by allowing public housing authorities, or PHAs, to leverage their aging yet valuable assets to make much-needed capital improvements. RAD allows the private market to invest and make reasonable returns while helping to fund these needs and to improve the look and feel of these assets. It also allowed us to go a step further and increase the supply of affordable housing by combining RAD with other affordable housing tools that have been around for many years, like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit and the Section 18 Disposition Program. One of the primary reasons HACA chose to pursue RAD is the old public housing funding platform has failed our residents in its inadequacy and inconsistency of funding. Public housing subsidy comes from two sources: operating fund and capital funds. Operating funds were meant to fund operations, salaries, maintenance, insurance. Capital funds were meant to cover capital needs. When RAD came to being in 2012, there was more than $26 billion backlog of capital repairs in public housing nationwide, which has continued to grow. This backlog demonstrates how underfunded capital funds have been for decades now. The operating funds were also underfunded through routine prorations, meaning whatever it cost a PHA to operate a property was prorated, 85%, 90%, not enough to properly run an apartment complex. This instability ultimately impacted the most vulnerable participants in the program, the people we are meant to serve, the reason that everyone at HACA and PHAs across the country come to work each day, the residents. RAD has allowed us to improve their quality of life in countless ways. In the properties we've rehabbed, residents now enjoy all new appliances, flooring, paint, kitchens, and bathrooms. We've been able to add new amenities to many units that most of us take for granted: air conditioning, dishwashers, garbage disposals, even washers and dryers. These modern amenities that are given in many market rate complexes are new to our public housing residents, and we would not have been able to do it without RAD. We chose RAD not to devolve ourselves to public housing, but to reinforce our ability to work towards our mission and serve our residents, the same residents we served under the public housing program. I must acknowledge that the RAD conversion is by no means perfect or easy for residents or staff. In fact, this is likely the hardest thing HACA has undertaken in 80 years. The task has been made easier working with an outstanding team of professionals at HUD, people like Tom Davis and Greg Byrne, who are among the strongest I've worked with. Removed from politics and with significant experience and knowledge of the inner workings of HUD, Tom and his team at HUD's Office of Recapitalization have been creative, forward-thinking, and solutions-oriented. Their help navigating this program has been invaluable. Now, as we look back at more than 1,700 units we've converted to RAD, with fewer than 100 to go, we can quantify the impact RAD has had. $80 million invested in the local economy through construction projects, $35 million in reserves set aside for future capital repair needs, almost 500 units rehabilitated and brought up to modern standards, 118 units, some built as many as 80 years ago, with no central air or handicap accessibility or modern amenities, have been demolished to be replaced by 276 brand new mixed-income units that have brought much-needed affordable housing units to Austin, and most importantly, a better quality of life for hundreds of families in Austin. Thank you for your efforts to support housing authorities across the country. It's been an honor to represent the Housing Authority of the City of Austin and discuss our efforts to improve and increase affordable housing in Austin. Thank you.
Gentlemen, the witness's time has expired. I now move to Mr. Collins. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Clay, Ranking Member Stivers, and members of the subcommittee. I am Bobby Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Authority of the City of Shreveport and the Housing Authority of the City of Winfield, both in Louisiana. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the vital importance and preservation of affordable and public housing. As you know, public housing has served as a vital resource for the working poor for nearly a century. In this same tradition, many public housing units are coupled with self-sufficiency programs and have income rules that encourage wage growth for residents by allowing flat rents. As this stock has aged, federal funding for capital improvements has not kept pace. Latest estimates suggest the current national backlog of unmet capital needs to be more than $70 billion. While other sources are available to affordable housing at large, each of these sources are scarce, often competitive, and outside capital is unavailable to public housing programs because of restrictions placed in the annual contributions contract and the Declaration of Trust. Recognizing this challenge, the Obama administration developed the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, a voluntary program aimed at preserving public housing as an affordable housing resource by converting existing capital funds and operating subsidies to a project-based Section 8 platform. Although this does not introduce additional funding from HUD, it does remove these restrictions, allowing former public housing sites to access private and public financing resources available to other affordable housing providers. This has represented more than $7.95 billion in affordable housing investment. Similarly, the Obama administration created the Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, which developed both a framework and limited competitive stream for comprehensive neighborhood redevelopment for low-income communities that include dilapidated or obsolete public or assisted housing sites. Through this program, successful grantees are provided grant funds to redevelop mixed-income communities and housing with either project-based vouchers or public housing replacement units mixed in with units for other income or subsidy types. Through this program, residents receive targeted case management services, are engaged through the planning and the implementation process, and are guaranteed a right of return. These programs have been fully embraced by the current administration, along with the introduction and expansion of other repositioning tools, such as Section 18 and streamlined voluntary conversion. While these programs remain voluntary, the administration has strongly encouraged housing authorities to pursue repositioning, with RAD being the predominant alternative. While RAD is an effective and necessary tool, it does have flaws. RAD largely relies on equity from low-income housing tax credit programs as a source of outside capital, which can be limited, competitive, and vary from state to state, and is very complex. And because of the inherent complex nature of layered financing, many smaller housing authorities that lack in-house development and finance capacity are left at a stark disadvantage and have become all too reliant on for-profit developers and HUD for assistance. While these programs can certainly be improved, though, they are a much better alternative than continuing to watch our public housing decline and disappear with no action while waiting on adequate funding from public housing through capital funds and operating subsidies. The most effective means of addressing the backlog of unmet needs for public housing program is to provide adequate funding to stabilize and preserve existing public housing properties, as proposed by Chairwoman Waters in H.R. 5187, the Housing as Infrastructure Act of 2019, and its companion measure introduced by Senator Harris in the United States Senate. This would place housing authorities in a better position to serve their communities, meet their affordable housing needs, and focus more of their time on the creation of new affordable housing opportunities and resources. Additionally, as more families are transitioned to the Housing Choice Voucher Program as a result of RAD and streamlined voluntary conversions, it is increasingly important to permanently stabilize the funding of the administrative fees used to properly administer the program. Currently, PHAs receive only 80 cents on the dollar for their administrative fees. This proration has been below 70 cents on the dollar in recent years. This greatly impairs the ability to plan and properly administer the HCV program. Absent these sweeping actions, however, Congress can continue to refine and develop asset repositioning programs and tools, including the RAD program, in order to ensure that they are more dynamic, that they allow local agencies to make local decisions, and that they provide additional financial resources to ensure the successful preservation of all affordable housing resources through technical assistance and grants. I hope the foregoing information has shed some light on the current status of the public housing program and ignites a fruitful conversation and subsequent action to address this great need. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this subcommittee. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony. At this time, we will recognize Dr. Popkin for 5 minutes.
Chairman Clay and Ranking Member Stivers, thank you for inviting me to testify today. The views I express today are my own and should not be attributed to the Urban Institute, its trustees, or its funders. I am honored to summarize the evidence and research on the role and future of public housing in the United States. First, public housing provides stability for more than 1 million extremely low-income households. The majority of these households are older adults or people with disabilities. The rest are families with children. Next, I will speak to the deteriorating state of the nation's public housing stock. And finally, I'll address the need to strengthen the policy tools that can ensure public housing is preserved for the future. The United States is facing the worst affordable housing crisis in a generation, with more households competing for an increasingly limited supply of rental housing. 3/4 of low-income renters, those with incomes under $15,000, are severely cost-burdened and pay more than half of their income for housing, and the shortage of low-cost units continues to grow. Public housing plays a critical role in the rental housing market, serving some of the lowest-income Americans. Public housing is the oldest housing subsidy program. Other major programs include housing choice vouchers and project-based rental assistance. Together, these programs serve only 20% of those who are eligible. But housing assistance is not an entitlement in the United States, and the supply of housing subsidies is not large enough to meet the growing need. Despite its important role, our nation's public housing program faces an uncertain future. Most public housing in the United States is at least 40 years old, built before 1975, and needs major capital repairs to keep it operational. The costs for these repairs are in the billions. Decades of funding cuts, poor management, and weak oversight from HUD have left many housing authorities to face the hard reality that they may not be able to keep their buildings open. More recently, the current administration has repeatedly proposed substantial cuts to the public housing operating and capital funds. And while Congress ultimately increased these funds, these resources are not enough to address the need. RAD has helped fund repairs and revitalization, but the program requires strengthening to ensure that the funds are adequate and that resident protections are consistently enforced. Unfortunately, HUD has encouraged housing agencies to remove projects from the public housing inventory. The Section 18 Demo Dispo program and voluntary conversions do not require replacing lost public housing subsidies. They also include few protections for tenant rights. Continued underfunding of the public housing program will cause more developments to deteriorate. Housing agencies will have little choice but to demolish or sell them. This has already occurred with more than 200,000 public housing units since the 1990s. Evidence from our research shows that the current implementation of Section 18 is likely to lead to a significant loss of public housing inventory. Finally, preserving public housing will require more resources and stronger policy tools. The RAD program, while controversial, can transform public housing and preserve units by converting them to project-based Section 8 contracts. Our recent evaluation of RAD showed generally encouraging results. Housing authorities have leveraged billions of dollars in private loans, tax credits, and other non-public housing funds to address capital needs. However, current law caps per unit RAD subsidies too low to adequately fund all the renovations needed at many properties. In particular, properties with large capital backlogs or those in locations where attracting private capital is difficult means RAD leaves some major needs unaddressed. Plus, RAD includes substantial tenant protections that other programs lack, including the right to return a choice mobility option that allows tenants to move with a voucher after a year or two. The Choice Neighborhoods Initiative, launched in 2009, is intended to address the shortcomings of the Hope 6 program. It is aimed at severely distressed properties, but has only provided grants for a modest number of properties thus far. We are currently evaluating the program's impact on residents and the surrounding neighborhoods. In conclusion, public housing provides safe, stable housing for some of the most vulnerable Americans, including an increasing number of older adults. Preserving this resource is especially important in light of the current and unprecedented shortage of affordable housing. However, underfunding, poor management, and weak oversight have left the nation's public housing stock at risk. Our current policy tools need strengthening if we are to avoid losing more deeply subsidized units. Thank you for the opportunity to share these insights with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
And I thank you for your testimony. Ms. Walz, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Ranking Member Stivers, Chairman Clay, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the topic of the nation's critically vital supply of public housing. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy at the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, a national nonprofit law and policy organization based in Chicago. For the past 18 years, I have represented thousands of public housing residents fighting to save their homes and communities and seeking to improve their living conditions. Most importantly, they seek a say in any decision to be made about their futures. In 2016, public housing residents who lived in 2 family developments operated by the Alexander County Housing Authority in Cairo, Illinois, reached out to my office for assistance. They were experiencing deplorable housing conditions, including pervasive mold and a severe rat and mouse infestation. HUD took over the Housing Authority in 2016, placing it into administrative receivership. However, HUD's administrative receivership did not improve the housing conditions. Indeed, in 2017, HUD announced it would close the developments and issue housing choice vouchers. This outcome meant not only that the families would lose their homes, but other families in Cairo in need of and eligible for public housing would have no opportunity to secure it. As it was documented in a July 24, 2018 report from HUD's Office of Inspector General, HUD appeared ill-prepared to do much more than move the public housing to demolition. At the time OIG issued its report, approximately 50 other public housing authorities around the country were also designated as troubled. In November of 2018, HUD's Office of Public and Indian Housing sent a letter to PHAs outlining the agency's efforts to convert public housing or reposition it to other forms of assistance, such as vouchers, impacting more than 200,000 public housing units throughout the country. These repositioning efforts are deeply troubling, as they appear to come with pressure from HUD staff to move public housing developments into demolition or disposition before other options, including preservation, are considered, and as well, there are consideration of the needs of the existing residents and the surrounding community. One example of a housing authority pressured by HUD to demolish came from Wellston, Missouri. The Wellston Housing Authority was in HUD receivership for more than 20 years. Shortly after exiting receivership, HUD staff actively pushed for the Housing Authority to demolish all 201 units of public housing, even though the community was in desperate need of affordable housing and HUD's 2 decades-long receivership should have stabilized the Housing Authority. Only after zealous advocacy by the tenants, their advocates, local officials, and Representative Clay and his staff did HUD agree to a plan that provides for a partial redevelopment of the affordable housing and project basing of the tenant-based vouchers. But not all housing developments and tenants have such champions, and nor does this victory signal a change in HUD's national repositioning policy. So what policies are needed to save this nation's important supply of public housing? First, the Public Housing Tenant Protection Act of 2020 is a promising start. It would require one-for-one replacement of demolished or disposed public housing units. It would protect tenants through the process, including through relocation, and it would devise a system to allow housing authorities to attract private investment to rehabilitate public housing, which has long been underfunded by the Public Housing Capital Fund program. Any effort to strengthen HUD's oversight of distressed public housing properties is also a priority, especially where HUD is taking a property into administrative receivership. The focus there should be on preservation, not disposition or demolition, and the improvement of that housing. The Averting Crisis and Housing Assistance Act is a promising start to that effort. Finally, there must be a commitment to address the dire backlog of public housing capital funds, which housing authorities rely upon to preserve and maintain public housing. H.R. 5187, the Housing as Infrastructure Act of 2019, could fully address that backlog. Thank you.
I thank the witness for her testimony, and we will now hear from Mr. Jones for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the subcommittee for this wonderful opportunity. My statements will be brief. My name is Eugene Jones. I'm a 35-year veteran of public housing leadership, both as a member of a HUD team sent to rescue and turn around ailing public housing authorities around this country. I am currently the president and CEO of Atlanta Public Housing, and for the last 5 years, I was the CEO of Chicago Housing Authority, the nation's second largest. It is this body of experience that informs my remarks today. I have seen all sides of the coin, what happens when there is full investment in public housing, what happens when there is not, and what happens when you view public housing as an asset, and what happens when it is seen as a warehouse or worse, as a blight. Viewing these questions both in terms of impact on the individuals and on communities. While we'll reference a variety of communities and experiences, there is no question that Chicago's public housing presents the most complete case study of building, the fall, and the resurrection of public housing, its residents and communities in which they live. I'm going to take a different tack based on my colleagues because I agree with most cases about the lack of funding and so forth for all these years, these 3 decades of lack of funding. But however, it takes a different view of how to manage, how to create, how to keep the housing that you have existing based on the limited resources. It provides a way in which you have to use your different skill sets in order to work public-private partnerships in order to make the best of maybe a bad situation. I have been blessed, or I have been lucky to work at housing authorities that have a funding mechanism that I can create and I can maintain and acquire housing. I've always said across this country, I think every housing authority should be an MTW, which is moving to work, because it provides flexibility for my colleagues of the smaller housing authorities as well as the medium-sized and the large to anticipate, to direct, and to assist in these public-private partnerships for flexibility in their funding that they get from HUD. It is grant, it comes in a bundle, you have fungibility, and you can provide the same amount of housing, but you can leverage those dollars and create better housing. And also with MTW agencies, you can provide an opportunity that you can be innovative. In Chicago, we did 3 libraries, which had public housing on top of the libraries for a community benefit for the whole community. And it was a resounding success because we were able to be very innovative, but using the state resources, using the city resources, using the HUD resources that we receive and all the other public-private partnerships and philanthropic agencies, that we can pool our resources together and come up with a strategy that's best for our community. I think if we work much better with other agencies like the VA, transportation, and HHS, because we're all in this together, is that how can we meld or fund our different aspects of what we provide in housing, transportation, education, and health. And so how could we manage that in a holistic approach and provide a better housing situation for our communities? Let us not forget that we're here as executive directors, CEOs, everyone who's on this panel. We are trying to protect the residents' rights. We're trying to protect the residents' well-being and their quality of life. I think with the resources that we have, I think they're limited, but I think the resources that we do have, that we can manage those resources to the best that we can and get the best product for our residents. And that is my end of my presentation. Thank you.
And I thank the gentleman, I thank all of our witnesses for their testimony. We now recognize the gentlewoman from California, who is also the chair of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your having this hearing. This is extraordinarily important, and I'm very concerned about what is happening with public housing in this country. I'm very worried about demolition of units and the non-replacement of units. I am not yet convinced that RAD is an answer We see all of the problems that we have with RAD now, and when we talk about the eventuality, perhaps, of public housing being in the control or hands of the private sector, that they will maintain affordable units, I don't trust all of this yet. So let me ask Mr. Collins about RAD. And many of our legislators here have basically concluded that maybe RAD is something that we have to have because of the need that you guys have for, upgrading and securing, the properties that you manage. But are you convinced that RAD can be used in order to rehabilitate and renovate and do all of that without some of the issues that I've seen up on the screen here today, where people were not properly supported in getting moved out of their unit? There was no assurance that they would have decent housing, whether that's to be temporary or permanent, et cetera, et cetera. Tell me what you think about RAD to this point, and how you think it could be made better, or why we should embrace it.
That's a great question, Chairwoman, and I will just respond by saying that so far that what we've seen in these conversions, let me say that RAD is an excellent tool in the toolbox. It's not an answer to all of our problems in public housing, but we're glad to have it in the toolbox. I will say that there's a RAD rider. We haven't seen how it will work so far to make sure that the units remain affordable after conversion. And so again, it hasn't been tested yet, but it's pretty strong and it's there. Now, my appreciation is it supersedes any mortgages or liens. So that would help assure that they remain affordable. In terms of the relocation, there's some very strong language in there to protect the tenants. Now, I can't speak to how well folks are adhering to it, but there's some very strong language in there to make sure that tenants are protected, as funds provided to make sure that the relocation costs are covered. I can't speak to the adequacy of some of the units they're relocated to with other housing authorities.
If I may just interrupt you for a moment, who enforces the so-called rules of RAD to ensure that everything that is in law about how RAD is to be operated, and I'm looking here, received uninhabitable temporary housing, permanently evicted from their homes, prohibited from organizing public housing. Who enforces that?
Yes, ma'am. I will just say that in preparing for this testimony, I did read the GAO report that came out in 2018, and I think even in that report, Housing and Urban Development acknowledges that there's some work to be done to make sure that those things are in place. So I can't speak to it directly. I'm not in a place to do that, but I think even they acknowledge there's some work to be done to make sure that those things that we need to have foresight are addressed.
The other thing that worries me is that RAD may be utilized to basically get rid of public housing in the future, that the final answer would be end up for the private sector. Banks, hedge funds, private equity people would end up owning public housing, and it can be converted into private housing. What do you think about my conclusion that that is a possibility?
Yes, ma'am. I can just say that the RAD rider also says that in the event of foreclosure, those kinds of things, and again, that we haven't seen how those teeth are going to work down the road, but it's there. It says that a housing authority must maintain control. If not, then I think it goes next to a public entity, but it's in there, and like I said, they've even acknowledged that those teeth haven't been tested. But
if you create the debt and you can't repay it to the entity that has invested in it, who does it belong to?
There are foreclosure potentials, and the only thing I can say is that I see it in there, and I'm not that expert to speak to it, but I see the language in there saying that affordability rider will supersede any mortgage liens that are on it. So that's all I can speak to, and I appreciate the concern.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very concerned and very suspicious. Thank you. I yield back the balance.
I thank the chairwoman for her questions. At this time, we recognize the ranking member from Ohio, Mr. Shriver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I appreciate all of your testimony. with all due respect to the academics on the panel, I'm going to focus my questions to the practitioners who've actually used the models. And so the three of you, Ms. Glass, Mr. Collins, and Mr. Jones, I'd like to talk to you about the RAD program. I think you all have given really important testimony. I think the RAD program is a great tool in your toolbox, as to quote Mr. Collins. I don't think it is necessarily something we should mandate. I think you need to figure out what is right for you. But there are really important riders to address the chairwoman's question, I think, in there that protect a public housing usage even under the RAD program. So I actually think it's a great way to leverage private capital. I care less about who owns these projects and more about taking care of the tenants and making sure we improve outcomes to deal with the aspirations, hopes, and goals and dreams to transition these people's lives. As I said in my opening statement, I care less about just putting a roof over somebody's head. I want to improve lives, and I think you do too. So could the three of you maybe in turn talk about both the pros and the cons of the RAD program? And frankly, I care more about what can we do to make it work better. To the extent there are issues with the RAD program, the Obama administration came up with it. I think it's been a good innovation. It leverages private capital. But what can we do to make that program work better? You want to start, Ms. Glass? And if you don't have any suggested improvements, that's okay too. But if you could just tell us if you think it generally is effective, and again, if there are things we can do better, that's what I think this hearing's all about. How do we improve the outcomes for the people that depend on public housing in this country? Thank you, Mrs. Glass.
I'll echo Mr. Collins' statement that RAD is not an appropriate tool for every housing authority. It's been great for Austin. I will also say that the RAD statute does require that housing authorities retain control of the property, and in Austin we've gone so far as to retain ownership of the property through a ground lease. So we understand the concerns that that control of the site be maintained through the housing authorities that have a mission to serve the residents that we're all here to serve today. As far as improvements to the RAD program, I think that additional funding is something that we have to consider. Okay. The most recent revision to the RAD notice offered $100 in additional rent per unit for properties in opportunity zones, and that's a great step in the right direction.
I would guess most of the properties that all of you own are in opportunity zones.
I can tell you that of our 18 public housing properties, only one was in an opportunity.
Really? I'm surprised by that. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and we had already finished our conversion, so we missed the boat on that. However, it was a positive step for additional funding, and I think that if smaller housing authorities are going to be able to do it, and other housing authorities who haven't been able to, additional funding is going to have to be part of it. Other than that, the only struggles that we have had have been on the programmatic side, and there are struggles in moving from the Section 9 of the Act to Section 8 of the Act.
Yes.
That we've worked through. But I will say that the multifamily office at HUD that we work with for the project-based rental assistance program has been open to talking about those concerns and working through those with us. So if
you want to detail those in writing to the committee, we'd love to hear that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'd be happy to do that. The other thing I'll say is that resident protections in this program are key, and we have to make sure that those are strong and strengthened. At the Housing Authority of the City of Austin, we made sure that residents were involved in every part of the process, and that they were fully protected through relocation.
And to the extent any of the issues with temporary relocation are issues any of you have seen, I think Republicans and Democrats would like to work on those issues, but I didn't hear any of the actual Housing Authority people talk about it. So
we made a considerable point to protect our residents throughout the process.
Thank you. And I only have 52 seconds, so if either Mr. Collins or Mr. Jones want to, Mr. Jones, do you have any ideas for improvement?
I just think that RAD is not the one size that fits all. I think it just depends on the community, the neighborhood, and so forth. I think there's a lack of understanding of the RAD program, especially when it comes to the housing authorities explaining to the residents the pros and the cons, because not every property needs a RAD. Right. Every property needs some assistance when it comes to capital improvements and so forth, so there are other options. But I think RAD is a good option, but it shouldn't be the only option that you use. I think the parameters in the RAD program are great. I think housing authorities should seriously look at it, but they should look at it in a way in which they understand the program, the outcomes, and the end results.
Thank you. Mr. Collins, I hope to give you a little more time. My time is out, but maybe somebody will yield me more time for you to talk about that, because I really care about what you have to say too. And I do want to hear from the academics who've studied this. If you want to submit anything in writing, I'd love to hear your ideas for improving the RAD program. I yield back the balance, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to start with Ms. Walz. From your work and background with the Wellston community in St. Louis, could you talk about some of the implications of the current situation and how lack of funding very likely contributed to the conditions there? And you know the history of being that housing authority being in receivership for 25 years with HUD. Proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Clay. You are likely the expert on Wellston, but my office did support Legal Services of Eastern Missouri in their representation of the public housing residents who live there. And
Thank you for that.
what we saw and what we observed on that site and in similar small public housing authorities around the country is they have years' worth of deferred maintenance due to insufficient capital funds. And as a result of that, residents are suffering. And so both in Wellston and in the Alexander County Housing Authority case that I mentioned prior to that, they were dealing with severe housing conditions where at that point, it did appear, at least for Alexander County, that demolition was the only option. And so what is the ideal scenario, both for the Wellstons of the world, which there are many, and Alexander counties of the world, which there are many, that are likely not eligible for RAD because they cannot access that private capital due to their conditions, due to their size, due to their financial situation, is to find another alternative there. You know, it may start with increasing the capital fund program. It's also to shift HUD's priority here, both with Alexander County and with Wellston and with other housing authorities we have seen in the Midwest. HUD's priority appears to be to demolish those developments. And I think what gets lost in the conversation often is it's not just that the public housing residents there lose their homes, but all the families in need in that community will not be able to access affordable housing. The public housing families will receive housing choice vouchers, that is true, but everyone else in need in that community is without an available option.
Thank you for that, which takes me to my next question. Dr. Popkin, can you discuss a little bit of the history of the Ida B. Wells housing development in Chicago, which was torn down? I'm interested in what happened to the people who used to live there. Where did they relocate? And did they have an option of coming back once rebuilding occurred?
So that is research we did 10 years ago now, in the early days of the Chicago Housing Authority. So we tracked some of the residents from Ida Wells. It was a different program. It did not have the same tenant protection. I think the tenant protections in RAD and choice neighborhoods are a reaction to what happened under Hope 6. I remember when choice neighborhoods came in, that was one of the problems. But because there had been litigation in Chicago, the Chicago Housing Authority was obligated to track the residents. And we were actually, I think, hired by the MacArthur Foundation to track what happened. The majority of residents did not return. Most of them took housing choice vouchers and moved to other areas of the city. It took a very long time for the development to be rebuilt. More people have returned over time. From some recent research we've done, we can see that. And most of the ones that we surveyed, the majority ended up in places where they felt they were safer and better off. That said, they came from some of the most miserable conditions, housing conditions they could have been living in. And it's your question, there wasn't enough housing for them to return to either, so it was a different scenario.
Will the gentlelady yield, Mr. Chairman? She still has some time.
Now, I was going to go to
Go
Mr.
right
Jones. He was over the Chicago Housing Authority. Perhaps you have some light you can share.
Well,
Can he please include Cabrini Greens with what happened with that?
Yes,
so
for
let me
sure.
talk briefly on both
Talk
of those,
about both of 'em.
developments. Now there are mixed income developments. There are successful developments in, one is in Brownsville, and Cabrini Greens is downtown Chicago. They have mixed incomes. They have great developments. We have in Brownsville, there's a Mariano's. Everything is community development, working very well with the aldermen in those communities and so forth. So it is coming about. Less crime, people are working, and it's just great community.
What happened to the residents?
The residents, as Dr. Popkin stated, it took so long for them to rebuild the development. People who have vouchers, if they have children and so forth, they choose another place, they're really going to stay there because they're more comfortable there. Some of them do move back, but the majority of them don't move back, but they're all welcome. And in Chicago, they know where every one of those residences are to this day.
And I thank you all for your response. And at this time, we will recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Interesting discussion today. I appreciate everybody's being here and the discussion. We've kind of centered on RAD for a little while here, and as I go through and look at some of the information and questions here, I think, Mr. Collins, I think you made a comment a while ago, and I think Mr. Jones, you followed up, I believe, with something similar to that, with pointing out a problem with regards to small housing units versus big housing units and the RAD program. Would you want to, either one of you would like to elaborate on it just a little bit?
The point that I was making actually in my testimony is that larger housing authorities have the advantage of having in-house development folks and financial folks, or being able to retain consultants. 80% of the housing authorities in this nation don't have that kind of money to go out and get consultants, or don't have that type of expertise in-house. And so that leaves them kind of depending on the developers, which is kind of the fox watching the hen house kind of thing. And it leaves them depending on developers and HUD to a limited degree. So I just think we need to strengthen their ability to analyze their deals and have some objective input before they make some of these decisions to convert, because they just don't have those resources as the larger housing authorities do.
Very good. I know in looking at this situation, you know, there are several ways of going about helping people afford housing. One of them is the RAD program. Another one is the vouchers, and another one is housing, you know, credits to build low-income housing. What would be the preference? What do you think is the best way to do this? Mr. Jones, Ms. Gass, you guys are in the business as well.
I think you need all different approaches.
All
that you
different
can.
approaches?
It just depends on how large your community is, how small it is, and so forth, and what you can afford, and who can you attract to develop some of these properties that we have. I mean, not all the properties that are vacant that are buildable, but what do you do with those, and when are they buildable? Can you make it a financial development that would strengthen the community and the surrounding community? Once we build public housing, we have to make sure that the public housing not only is a seamless transition in the neighborhood, that it fits in within the neighborhood. And so if you look at the RAD program, as my colleague had stated, is difficult because a lot of them don't have the experience like larger housing authorities do, because they have a development staff that can understand how to do these RAD deals. I think one of the things that we did in Chicago is that we helped some of the smaller housing authorities. They would come up to Chicago, and we would sit there and we would talk about what a RAD deal would mean, what a tax credit deal would do, and what just building self-development. So we are trying to help our smaller agencies, as well as we're trying to build up the capacity so that they can make better informed decisions.
Is one of the requirements with the RAD program to have a mixed-use structure there, or is it continue to just exist, to just continue to be all apartments owned, just switch ownership and improve the building?
You still have a fiduciary responsibility. A housing authority has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that development still continues to work. And it provides the quality of life issues that we determined that we wanted to change it to a RAD development.
Well, I know that I used to chair this committee a couple sessions ago, and we went to, I took a field trip down to New Orleans and saw the rebuild of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and you know, a lot of the new communities they've actually built there, by the way they've done this, is to go in and actually have mixed-use use structures so that, you have apartments, condos, and you have businesses all in the same building, and you basically built back a community there. And it seemed to be very successful. I was wondering if your thought would be on that.
I was there before and after Hurricane Katrina. I was responsible for moving our staff and finding our residents and relocating them to Houston, Dallas, and also Atlanta. And so we had mixed income developments, and the sad thing about it, we had a big one, Desire, and we had a couple of Hope 6 sites that were devastated by the hurricane. And subsequent to after the hurricane, they did look at the same model that we've had before the hurricane came to do mixed income finance developments there, and they worked very well.
Ms. Gass, can you give me I got 30 seconds to go here. Give me some quick responses to the questions asked, Mr. Jones.
Certainly. I think for Austin, one of the benefits of RAD was that we were able to address the needs of the property based on the property. So we have a property that we have completely demolished, 156 units, and we're rebuilding in its place 400 units. It's a low-density area. It's right next to downtown. It's a great place to do that. We've had other properties where we've been able to make improvements throughout the years, and they had fewer needs, and so I think that flexibility in RAD is something that's good. In the property that I mentioned with the 400 units, we're also expanding resident service areas so we can provide workforce development, education, job training, financial literacy courses, digital literacy courses, and RAD enabled us to do that by adding additional space for services as well as some retail, so some mixed use.
Thank you very much, Mike.
And I just wanted to point out to my fellow Missourian that after the tornado that devastated the city of Joplin, HUD as well as other federal agencies came together and stood that town up pretty quickly because they focused on how to get them back going, just to make you aware.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you. At this time, we will recognize the gentlewoman from New York who happens to be the chair of the full committee on small business, Ms. Velasquez, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking member, for holding this important hearing. Director Gass, in your opening testimony, you mentioned the potential capital benefits of RAD, such as new carpet, air conditioning, and appliances. However, RAD is only a one-time capital infusion. How are you intending to make additional repairs next time they are needed or when the 20-year P&A expires?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. In addition to the $80 million that we have been able to put in as a resource now into physical repairs, we have $35 million that is now set aside in a reserve for replacement account that is set aside exclusively to address the capital needs of these properties. It was done through a capital needs assessment, so we had to forecast out 20 years to make sure that we had the funds to address all those capital needs. If at the expiration of the 20 years, a recapitalization is necessary, we're able to do that to address capital needs going forward. But to have the $35 million set aside for 20 years is an attractive thing for us. We've never had the resources to be able to address the capital needs in that way.
Okay. And Director Gass and Collins, I understand both of your PHAs are utilizing the RAD program. Would either of your PHAs be using the RAD program if we were fully funding the capital fund in the way that is needed?
No, ma'am. There would be no need.
Okay.
This is to address deferred capital needs, and if it was fully funded, there would be no need, so no, ma'am.
Thank you. Ms. Gass?
By and large, I agree. The one thing that RAD has given us the opportunity to do that I don't think would be allowed under the scenario they're talking about is that we have been able to leverage low-income housing tax credits with our RAD conversion. And so, again, the example that I used before, being able to go from 156 to 400 units, that was because we had the additional subsidy that came in the form of tax credits, and that has been allowed us to add affordable units. Not subsidized units, but affordable units. So I think that's been a big benefit to Austin.
But if Congress decided to fully fund the capital program, I don't see how we should make every effort not to go into the private sector and work out this type of financing where we might be compromising tenant protections. Just this week, the city is a newspaper online in New York discuss what is happening in the only RAD development that exists in New York City, and that is in Congressman Meek's district. And it's talking about how the private developer is moving to evict for non-payment or late payment. The fact that today, residents of public housing development in New York could go to the website and check the status of repairs, close tickets, and so forth, yet this private developer is not required to have a website where those residents can check and have any type of information. So, Dr. Popkin, what are your thoughts? Would programs like RAD be necessary if the capital fund was fully funded?
I would agree with my Housing Authority colleagues here on the panel. No, it is clearly it was an attempt to find the funding that has been deferred for so long. I think, however, one provision of RAD that I think is worth preserving is the choice mobility voucher option that people in the current public housing program do not have access to.
Okay. So how will, Dr. Popkins, how will converting from public housing to Section 8 affect the long-term affordability of public housing projects? What protections has HUD put in place to ensure a converted property remains affordable?
So the RAD program currently requires that the rents be kept the same as
30%.
public housing, that the leases be renewed after 16 years and kept affordable. Beyond that, there are not, I mean, I think Mr. Collins was saying there is no guarantee if there's a foreclosure, and we don't know. We are currently evaluating the program, but it is still in the early days.
Thank you. Ms. Walz, what additional protections are needed to ensure RAD is living up to its goal in preserving affordable housing, given HUD's spotty track record in ensuring tenant protections and rights during RAD conversions? How can Congress make sure these rights and protections are being enforced?
I'm going to allow the witness to answer. The gentlewoman's time has expired. Please respond.
Thank you.
So much.
There are protections within the public housing program, some of which are in the RAD program, but more could be there, including that there is a right to construct a resident organization, democratically elected, and that they are a way of the residents to come together collectively to represent their interest. There should be sufficient monitoring of the programs, particularly where relocation is involved. That's where we see tenants fall through the cracks the most. There needs to be assurance and monitoring that the same size units or the units that the residents need are actually rebuilt or redeveloped. And if these are accessible units, they continue to be accessible units. Those types of protections and monitoring, I think, could greatly improve the RAD program and make it work for residents.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank her for the question. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I come at this from a slightly different view than what we have here on the panel. You point to very important issues in a lot of our metropolitan areas. I happen to represent rural Colorado, and rural America is often forgotten in this conversation. On a per capita basis, often when you look into our communities, which typically have lower incomes, we probably on a per capita basis maybe have a bigger problem on that per capita basis than a lot of our urban neighbors do. Frequently talk to a lot of the hardworking folks in our district, and just given some of the challenges that we face there in terms of property costs, in terms of some of the rules and regulations, not from the federal government, but are compounded at the city, the county, and the state level, we're seeing increasing costs that address a number of the concerns actually as a cost driver that we're pointing at in terms of some of the funding. toured one facility that was building affordable housing in Glenwood Springs. The cost is $380,000 per unit. Where I come from, that's expensive. And it's going to be labeled as affordable housing to be able to actually achieve that. And so I think we've got, through those regulatory processes, something that we do need to be able to define if we're going to be able to get some of those costs down. I think, Ms. Gass, you pointed to some good leveraging of dollars to be able to expand in Austin from, I think you said 156 to 400 plus units that you were able to actually see expand. But I would like to be able to get maybe just a sense of, is RAD a good program that came in under the Obama administration and maybe needs some tweaks to be able to follow through with? What are your thoughts? Would you label it as a good program?
It has been very good for Austin.
Okay. Mr. Jones, what's your sense?
It has been a very good program for the agencies that I've worked with from Chicago. Land is doing that right now and some other places. Again, Congressman, I think it's one size does not fit all. They really have to look at the opportunity that they have right now, and it's just an alternative. It's not that you have to do a RAD in these larger housing authorities, because they do have capital funding available to fix those elevators, fix those chillers, and those types of big ticket items and so forth. But I think based on your portfolio, your physical needs assessments and so forth, it tells you what you need to do at what period of time and how do you go over the next 5 to 10 years. But it is a good program.
Well, and I think that's something, you know, every one of us know, $23 trillion debt in the country. There are not a lot of available resources that we're going to be able to dip into. And so what's your assessment maybe of the private-public partnerships? Is this opportunity to be able to create a win-win?
Say that again, Congressman.
With private-public partnerships in terms of affordable housing, is that an opportunity to be able to create a win-win where we aren't necessarily always using just taxpayer dollars, but getting that private investment to come in? Is that a desirable?
Yes, absolutely.
Of course. What do you think, Ms. Walz?
With sufficient tenant protections and with the opportunity to ensure that all PHAs, not just medium-sized and large PHAs or PHAs in metropolitan areas, are able to attract that private capital. And so there needs to be some re-envisioning of the RAD program so that it's a bigger universe of PHAs that are eligible and able to secure that private capital. And I think just to your point about rural America, Congressman, I'll just say that the hard units are especially critical in rural America, where it's very hard to use a housing choice voucher. In Cairo, Illinois, it was about as rural as you could get on the southern tip of Illinois. Residents had to move at least 50 miles to find a property owner who would take their housing choice voucher.
Yeah, and frankly, in our district, you know, part of it is the regulatory ends of it, not my backyard, you know, to be able to address that. Mr. Jones, one other issue I'd like to be able to hit on, it struck me when you talked about the holistic approach. We have PHAs in my district, and they deal with literacy training for financial issues, healthcare, their costs, parental guidance, and whatnot. Should we be looking at that whole picture in terms of getting people really to the point where they will hopefully not need to be able to have low-income assistance?
Absolutely. We need a holistic approach, because that adds to the success of any public housing in their city, in their jurisdiction, and so forth. So if you piecemeal it and you do onesies and so forth, it's not going to get there.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, we recognize the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Heck, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, thank you so very much for holding this very, very, very important meeting. I think I want to direct a question to Mr. Jones and Ms. Gass. After using 2 words and then riffing a little bit on each of them and asking a question about that to you. The 2 words are supply and ecosystem. Supply. This nation is suffering from a housing supply crisis. By every objective measure, we are somewhere in the range of 5 to 7 million or more housing units short of what is needed to meet legitimate demand. 5 to 7 million. That circumstance is felt throughout communities in America, all of America, but in varying degrees. The reality is that if you want to buy an upper-end home, you're probably going to get your need met. Just about everywhere else within the range of housing unit availability, there is a crunch to one degree or another. The crunch is especially acute for what we would call starter homes, for those seeking to grasp the first rung of equity building. Now, let me use a second word, ecosystem. This circumstance of a housing supply shortage is felt throughout the entire housing unit delivery ecosystem. Let me use the example I did of starter units. If you have fewer starter units available, and we do, that's measurable. Builders aren't building starter housing units. And what that means is if you're trying to get out of renting it into home ownership, you're having a tough time. Or if you're a baby boomer seeking to downsize, you're having a tough time. So if you can't get that rung, what happens? More people stay renting. If more people stay renting, occupancies go up. If occupancies go up, what happens? Rents go up. Supply, demand, pure and simple. More people become rent burdened. More people are in need of public subsidy. And frankly, even more people become homeless because we have a housing supply crisis and because the provision of housing units is an ecosystem. That's the fact. I think it should be noted the way in which this burdens households. Not only are more and more people spending more than 30% of their income on rent, but in fact, in the last 15 years, the single largest increase in household budgets isn't higher education, isn't even health care. It is housing cost. And as I like to preach in this committee, I got 3 other favorite words: pillow, blanket, roof. If you don't have a pillow to lay your head down on, a blanket to keep you warm, and a roof over your head to keep the rain off of you, then any other issue that may be confronting you in life, be it unemployment or substance abuse or mental health, is not going to be successfully addressed. So this is a national crisis due to lack of supply and how it reverberates throughout the ecosystem. Mr. Jones, how does the lack of affordable housing supply impact your ability to serve your communities?
It's very difficult, and it's the cost. The cost of developing mixed income developments is extraordinary. It just goes over your head. As the Congressman has stated, you have a total development cost of about $370,000 for one unit, maybe a 1-bedroom based on your locality. You can take that same amount of money and probably build 2 homes in a different area and get a 2-for-1, but that's not how we work within the rules of the developments in which we do. Cost is always a burden with us. We have to look at every type of financing opportunity, which is tax credits, which is philanthropic dollars, which is historic tax credits, new market tax credits. We have to be a financial wizard when it comes to trying to finance some of these deals, and still, we can't get the best bang for our buck. When we're looking at replacing 500 units and based on total development costs and so forth, we may be able to do 275. And so the difficulty—
And the need is?
Right, is 500. And so the difficulty is going back to those residents, say, hey, look, I can only build 375, I can't build a 500, and so I'm left with, that over 100 units that I don't know what I'm gonna do. And so now I gotta go to the next development and figure that out.
I see my time's out. I apologize, Ms. Gass, but let me close with this sentiment. I perceive the discussion thus far in this committee to be, unfortunately, an all too rare but delightfully bipartisan tone and discussion. Every member in Congress is suffering from this problem in their district, and it behooves us all to figure out ways to help solve it and mitigate it because of the profound and significant nature of it. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The gentleman from Washington yields back. At this time, we recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the witnesses for appearing today. I think this issue, like so many others, a lot of us, or at least I, fly over it at 30,000 feet, and so it's good to hear from people on the ground who deal with this day in and day out. And with that, Mr. Jones, if I could, with you, in my district, and I represent part of Memphis and then a rural part of West Tennessee, we have about 10,000 homes that are served through the Housing Choice Voucher Program. From a real-world standpoint, can you talk to me about, in real terms, how easy or how hard it is for those individuals who participate in the program to, in fact, find housing?
It's very, very hard to find the house or the apartment or whatever your means of what you're trying to look for. It's very hard to find those accommodations. Residents are looking for quality of life issues. They're looking for better schools, better neighborhoods, and so forth, and opportunities of jobs. The hard part is that a lot of these landlords won't accept Section 8. That's number one. And number two, they can't find the quality unit that they're looking for because it costs too much. You have to understand, on the Section 8 voucher program, we have FMRs with fair market rents. We can only pay up to a certain amount, 100% or 120%. Now, if you want to live in a better neighborhood, the system won't allow you to move into the north, which may be more prosperous and so forth. And so HUD won't allow you to go over a certain amount of your FMR unless you do reasonable accommodations and so forth. So there's so many parameters that fights against us instead of trying to help us house, because at the end of the game, our business is to house individuals the best way we can, give them the best quality unit and so forth. And so it's just a matter of preference. A lot of residents have different needs, different requirements, accessibility issues, aids and so forth when it comes to living conditions and so forth. And, you know, a lot of these homes have been built back in the 50s and 40s and so forth. They don't have accessibility issues. They don't have ramps or those types of things. And that's always an issue also. When you have to turn back a voucher because you can't find adequate living conditions, that's really a sore aspect of what we do when we try to do our job the best that we can.
Thank you very much. If I could, along a different line, as far as metrics in your experience, does HUD do a good job or an adequate job of tracking how individuals or families, whether in fact they do in fact exit these programs? And if not, do you have a solution?
I think, based on my experience, I think they do an adequate job. The issue is that we have to feed that information into HUD, and so they do the metrics on all the information. And at local housing authorities, we also do our own matrix to make sure that we're fulfilling our HUD requirements and our regulations and so forth. As I always say, the proof is in the pudding. I think based on what we get from HUD and what we use locally, we merge the two together, and I think we can somehow come up with a good explanation of where we should be at and where we should be going.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. At this time, we will recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the committee. Mr. Jones, I know that you are very familiar and has worked a long time in the housing situation in Atlanta. And I'd like to tell you that many years ago when I was coaching at the college level, I spent a lot of time in those housing complexes in Atlanta recruiting athletes because you had very good athletes in those areas. The thing I would ask the question, I probably asked all the committee, when the decisions are made that they're not going to repair these housing complexes, but they're going to tear them down and give vouchers to residents to find another place to stay, what kind of effect does this have on that community and whether they will be returning? And I'll start right here with Ms. Glasgow down the line.
In in Austin, we did give residents vouchers for relocation. And they were able to take those out on the private market, and we provided a lot of assistance to help them. As Mr. Jones said, it's not easy to use a voucher. We made sure that every resident who got a voucher to use for relocation was able to find a place that was adequate, that was decent, safe, and sanitary, and met their family's needs. I will say that most of the residents who relocated from our housing projects have come back. The ones that haven't, although we did not like to lose them from the community from which they came, we have to remember that when they were put in place at that property, they weren't given a choice to say, would you like to live at this property or this property? They were told, we have an opening at this property, you can move here, you can move to the bottom of the list. So getting that voucher and getting the choice to use it wherever their family chose to use it was actually a good thing for them. And when they found that place and they relocated and they found a new school or they found a new church, the new doctor, they were closer to their family and chose to stay there, we would have loved to have had them back, but for their family, that was the right choice. And I think one of the things that makes RAD great is that it does give more residents more choice and more control.
Ms. Collins.
I just want to say, when you talk about demolition, I just want to make sure that we point out at that point, you've had to illustrate obsolescence to HUD, which means that that project would cost more than 60% of the total development cost, which means it's in really bad shape. So when you talk to a resident about moving out of a condition of that nature, it's a little bit easier conversation, but there are plenty of meetings, and they're informed the whole way. They have relocation assistance, they have relocation budgets, and so for most of them, it's just a better opportunity for them, and it puts the housing authority in a better situation because you're providing higher quality housing, and you're able to better support that tenant.
Yeah, Dr. Popkin.
So this housing authority I've studied the most is Chicago. People who moved out have ended up in better housing in safer neighborhoods. I think that you asked the question of what does it mean for the community as well, not just for the people who moved out. We know that because, as you said, the housing is obsolete, and in the case of Chicago and a lot of cities, it's really blighting the neighborhood around it. And we know that crime went down in the communities where the housing was removed and redeveloped. I think the concern that I have, and a lot of people have, is what does that mean for the housing prices in the neighborhood, whether people will come back, and whether it's going to spur gentrification. And I think we are studying choice neighborhoods and looking at that issue right now.
Yeah, Ms. Walz.
So the tenants do receive notice under Section 18 if there is a proposed demolition or disposition of the site, but it is a foregone conclusion at that point. And so the focus of that notice and the meetings with residents is that you will be moving, you'll be receiving a housing choice voucher. There isn't a mandate on the type of relocation assistance or support residents receive, and that is an ongoing problem and challenge. And so oftentimes it can be quite disruptive to the residents and their families who have to move, schools potentially, employment, and are oftentimes on their own looking for a landlord who would be willing, but not legally required, in most cases, to rent to them with a housing choice voucher. So we do see that disruption. I also note that it's particularly disruptive to seniors who may intend to age in place in these public housing units, and moving into the housing choice voucher program is very hard on them.
I only got a few seconds. Mr. Jones, what have y'all done in the Simpson Road area?
It can be devastating, especially to the schools that community is in and so forth. That may close down that elementary school, that middle school. That has a devastating effect, closer to job opportunities and transportation. But also, I'd like to remind you that in bigger housing authorities, sometimes they may not accept a voucher. They may go on another public housing site that accommodates their various needs. So there is options. They can stay on a public housing site if there's a vacancy, which they choose, or they can have a housing choice voucher.
I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Clay, and thanks to Ranking Member Stivers, and thank you to the panelists for being here today and for taking time to join us and share your wisdom with us. When it comes to taxpayer dollars, we have a responsibility to ensure that every dollar spent by the federal government is used wisely, efficiently, and for its intended purpose. Once again, though, I fear today we're here discussing how we can solve our housing problems by throwing more money at them. The Congressional Research Service has published estimates that Congress has appropriated nearly $1.7 trillion to HUD since its creation in 1965. Public housing currently occupies some of the most expensive land in the nation, with concentrations in cities on the east and west coasts. Current stock is old and continues to age. More money may help alleviate some of the issues that face public housing today, but it will not fix many of the underlying problems. Mr. Jones, both Republican and Democratic administrations have expressed the view that public housing is an outdated model that, in many cases, concentrates poverty, is too expensive, and can be subject to mismanagement and neglect. Do you agree with those views?
I do.
What is it about the current public housing model that lends itself to some of these issues?
There's numerous of issues that public housing doesn't work. I mean, I will agree with my colleagues, is lack of funding, lack of experience. Some of these housing agencies are mismanaged, one of the cases. Just a lot of just not, let me go back. Then there's a lot of individuals going in and out of housing, different CEOs. There may be 5 CEOs in 5 years and so forth. That's always disruptive and so forth. And so they miss their motion, where they want to go, their mission and so forth. And so it's accumulation of a lot of things. I mean, you have to have a good city a partnership with your colleagues there. They have to work with you. If they're not working with you, then you have other community issues that you have with the councilmen and aldermen and so forth. So it's everything. I mean, being in charge of a housing authority is a daunting task when you have to bring all these factions of the community, the city, the aldermen, the councilmen, the congressional staff and so forth, to talk about how do we do this best and how can we use the best resources and not waste taxpayers' dollars. That's always a critical point. We want to make sure that we protect that, but we also may stop doing what we think we should do because we think we may be wasting taxpayers' dollars.
I think we agree that we need smarter, more innovative solutions than the ones we've largely been discussing today. But there are some existing programs that have shown promise, and I'd like to drill down on those a bit. The Moving to Work program, MTW, demonstration program that was created by Congress in 1996 to give HUD and local public housing authorities the flexibility to test alternative policies for providing housing assistance is one. These alternative policies are intended to increase the cost effectiveness of assisted housing programs, promote self-sufficiency, and increase housing choices for low-income families. Mr. Jones, what has your experience been with the MTW program, and in your opinion, is it serving its intended purpose?
I think the Chicago model is a great model that everyone can use or take a look at. I'm not saying that it's the best model. I think it's a great model, and I think it could be replicated in other places. There's 39 MTW agencies right now. I think most of them are doing well. It gives us the opportunity to have flexibility and leverage our dollars. Developers, community, and so forth look at MTW agencies to be very innovative and be a part of a solution to provide more affordable housing and more opportunities in their communities. Atlanta Housing Authority, I've just been there for about 90 days, and it's an MTW, and they've done wonderful things over the 20 years that they've been on the MTW, well, less than 20 years, but they've done pretty successful things and innovative things in Atlanta. And all my other colleagues, I've heard great things about what they've done in the MTW.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, we recognize a gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses here. This has been an interesting dialogue for me because my early experiences were all in public housing. Right out of college in Ohio, I was one of those individuals that had to go in and do the housing inspection for what you were allowed to have or not. I didn't like that very much, so I moved on to doing other things with housing and then became a consultant doing a lot of the relocation work. Funny, history repeats itself because then we were relocating individuals out of public housing, trying to get them to Section 8 vouchers because HUD was going through a transition for those properties who were owned, and the people got the checks for renovating and had full ownership, and those business people made a lot of money. Then it transitioned, as you know, you're all nodding, so I can stop. You know that story. So here we are today, and I am struggling. I am struggling because I don't believe that we are no longer living in a society of poverty, that we are no longer free from economic decay. While I wish all that was true, I don't believe it to be so by 2021 or 2025. So my community is very much like yours, Mrs. Gass. We are, as the language go, or your language go, we are moving away from public housing, and RAD is the savior of all of this. So help me understand, without RAD, what happens? We move people into transition, we get rid of all of our public housing, yet I know there will be people still coming up who need public housing, because in Ohio, we have thousands of people who are on the wait list for Section 8. And the transition has been, you wait and you're so happy for a housing to get into a public housing to bring your family with you. Then I think as we try to have our motto is we want people to become self-sufficient or self-reliant. That was the language we used to use, and that meant you moved out of housing, you moved into Section 8, and then you got into rentals on your own or home ownership. So if we're taking away that foundation, we have a wait list with Section 8, what happens next year? No more RAD, no more public housing, Section 8, wait list all over the country. What happens? What should I be advocating for? You know, we just heard how my colleagues started on the other side about the land, about the cost. What happens? What should I do?
I just want to say that in Shreveport is a choice community, which means we've got a planning grant and an implementation grant. And that's going to afford us the opportunity to build almost 500 new units. And half those units will be affordable. They'll have vouchers attached to them that we still control.
We just won't call them public housing?
Yes, ma'am. They'll be.
So we're really just changing the name, but people still in poverty, still moving up, will be in something, we just won't call it public housing.
Yes, ma'am. And I think that's what everybody's trying to paint, that we're not, the affordability component of it is not going away. Just the name is changing. We're doing those things and leveraging those resources that are available to make sure that not only we don't want to take away choice of public housing, but make sure that we can reinforce affordable housing for folks. So it will be a replacement of that housing. And that, what my appreciation is of what the programs are designed to do. And in Shreveport, we see them effectively working. We have RAD conversions, we have choice neighborhoods, we have our state finance agency programs that are converting, but all these things are creating more affordable housing. That's still our mission.
And we have that too, but what about the smaller? You know, there are only so many, like my public housing, that are the large public housing. So somebody help me understand what happens to the smaller public housing that does not have all of that to help with the infrastructure. And if we keep cutting money in HUD to go back for some of the programs like family unification and other things that help, what happens to this? I'm not concerned about the big public housing because they have the resources. I'm concerned with the smaller ones, like I'm concerned with the people who find themselves at the bottom. The people who are at the top, it's easier to get out of anything when you're almost have your head above the water.
Can I just say, I think that's the challenge, that it's hard to put our arms around it because it's so dynamic from city to city, from organization to organization. What works for one may not work for another.
I'm only concerned about the small. What happens to them?
The small ones, we're going to have to reinforce some of those programs to get them better assistance so that they can evaluate those tools and better leverage those tools. So I agree with you. We need to do something.
And I know my time is up, Mr. Chairman. And please let me know, I appreciate your work, Mr. Collins, and everyone else. I'm trying to help us, not be against you all, because what we do know, for the least of us, When we don't have the resources and we're not putting it back in, and you have people in programs who don't have it, those are the individuals that lose. Thank you.
The gentlewoman yields back. At this time, we recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Steele, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate my colleague's remarks from Ohio on the distinction between the big cities and the small cities. I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Collins, in just a moment, because I want to follow up on that. But I want to ask Mr. Jones a question first. I have family that live in the city of Chicago, and my commute down from Wisconsin as a kid would take me by Cabrini Green. So I saw it regularly, kind of this whole journey through the 80s, 90s, into what it is today. And the Mariano's that's there today, I've stopped and picked up groceries, which might not have been an opportunity presented to myself about 20 to 30 years ago. Is you look at the evolution that Chicago saw in shifting from the model that it had to the model it has today. And I think maybe a lot of us in this room know, but I think it's good for the record as we discuss the terminology here. Public housing sometimes gets painted with a broad brush, but I'm thinking of public housing in the context that it is direct management and ownership of housing units by publicly chartered entities funded by the federal government. Sometimes I see the term used more broadly to refer to all rental assistance programs, Section 8 housing vouchers, housing choice vouchers. I'm talking about public housing in the traditional sense of the word, which I think is a key distinction between the two. Could you just walk through a little bit of where you saw that evolution in Chicago as it played out in safety, social mobility, and the number of people served?
Well, I think the model in Chicago worked because of the MTW status and the plan for transformation, because we were on a fast clip to either acquire, build, or provide housing choice vouchers or project-based rental assistance to get to those 25,000 units that we tore down. They tore down over the last 10 years and so forth. And so for that transformation, and when we put all those resources together, HUD invested about $2 billion in that plan for transformation to get it from where it was, those high rises and so forth, that was crime-ridden. There was not enough, maintenance was poor. There was no job opportunities. There was no camaraderie. There was no neighborhoods. And they were isolated from all the other parts of the city of Chicago. The Chicago Housing Authority was the second largest city in the state of Illinois, but they were so isolated from railroad tracks and other side and so forth. And so when they broke down those barriers, then it became a seamless transition, so they fit into the neighborhood. When you go down State Street and so forth in Chicago, you could never tell that this used to be Taylor Homes or anything else that was associated with public housing. It is a mixed income development on both sides of the streets and so forth. And so that model does work, and it still works today with the Cabrini. IW Wells has transformed to another development. All the other different things that they've done over there is just amazing.
I appreciate your comments. I also think it's interesting the Brown line in Chicago doesn't stop at Division, which there's probably some history to that I'm unaware to, but that's clearly an issue when that was the traditional Cabrini Green that it was, that residents who lived there didn't have access to the mainstream Chicago public transit area that I'm not an expert in. Let me shift back over to Mr. Collins, if I can. While we're talking about public housing, I want to just shift gears a little bit and discuss a little more broadly affordable housing solutions that might help families provide a platform for that social mobility. Specifically, I want to focus on how federal financial assistance and federal policies impact public housing authorities in small and mid-sized cities. In particular, in my district, in the city of Racine, we have large areas of poverty, but without traditional public housing, but areas that have a lot of federal assistance. When I've listened to your testimony today, I think a lot about that there's parallels between areas that you've worked in the city of Racine, in my district. We've heard a lot about what works and doesn't work well in big cities. Can I just give you another minute to discuss some of the lessons that you've learned from your experience working in smaller cities?
I think in smaller cities and smaller housing authorities, of course, we're all used to adapting to change, and I think you find that there's more of a reluctance to adapt to change. And so we just need to do a better job of educating those housing professionals in rural America on what their options are and making them feel more confident that they can leverage these programs, et cetera. So I just find that housing is so dynamic. You have these large agencies, and that's where policy seems to be focused. And I think that we need to kind of make sure that we categorize this a little bit better so that we can shift some of the policies and tailor it a little bit more to some of the smaller agencies and what some of their concerns are.
I appreciate your comment, and I think it's really important that we stay focused in on the distinction between some of the problems that exist in some of our large urban areas and some of the struggles that we have in some of our smaller and mid-sized cities. Appreciate you being here, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. At this time, we recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all so much for being here. One of the things in my district is many of the housing justice advocates have been focused on formulas, right? For years, we've been focusing on trying to increase funding and so forth, and we do both. But right now is more and more, well, how do they define affordable housing? Is AMI working? Is this a form of legalized speculation, right? So these structures and these formulas that are in place right now are not really translating into, I think, real affordable housing. It may have at the beginning, but somehow it's been, I use strong words like hijacked by the industry to be able to move towards something much more lucrative, much more for-profit, where others are left out. And so it can't just be about funding anymore. And I think there's been kind of an awakening among the housing justice community in that effort and saying, look, we have to look at it in a way that, is it going to stick? Is it going to be sustainable? In vulnerable communities like mine, 13 districts strong is the third poorest congressional district. We have, I think, throughout Wayne County, the 12 communities, we have a shortage of about 36,000 affordable housing units for extremely low-income renters. And I mean, HUD's talking about, I think, decreasing, eliminating about like 125,000 units by 2020. We know that's not going to work. One of the things that has really been discussed, other than the approach of RAD, which some are thinking it could be a legalized form of speculation, and I want to hear from you all about this, is that, and when I say legalized speculation, is basically these for-profit, these kinds of so-called developers, they get little fancy names, whatever. These folks want to come in and make money on the backs of, allow us to subsidize and so forth, make money on the backs of the public and the poor, and then later be able to just keep it and own it. And we see it over and over again in Detroit all the time. But one of the things that we've been talking about is, instead of only using Section 8 housing vouchers for rental, expanding it to use for home ownership. And yeah, there's only a small portion of this. And can you all talk about that? Because it is bizarre for me that we haven't actually really dug deeper into how do we increase home ownership and create economic stability for a family. We do it for the developer. They get to own it with our money, but we can't give it to a mother and say, here, we're gonna give this to you and you're gonna take it. And so I really think it is critically important that we start thinking about why can't we expand and say, look, here's a Section 8 voucher, go become a homeowner, we're gonna here be able to help you. Think just how bizarre that we don't see it that way. Instead, we want them to be renters forever, which is instability, which is, it is. We have to fight continually to keep it affordable for them, where we can actually get them into a home. So I want to hear from you all. What are you doing to push HUD towards expanding Section 8 vouchers towards home ownership?
Congressman, I was in the Detroit Housing Commission from 2007 to 2012. And so we rebuilt back a bunch of those Hope 6 sites, Old Herman Gardens, you have Emerald Springs on the east side and so forth. Home ownership, HUD has a program, the Section 8 program, rent to own. And so we specified, because the rent to own is they're able to rent a unit and not become renters for life, but also use that rent money that they're paying for to pay down on eventually a house. And so we've been supporting that, and I know my colleagues who have a Section 8 program, we do the rent to own program. It's been very successful. In Chicago, we probably had about 600 people who have turned from a family self-sufficiency program to a rent-to-own program to home ownership. The same thing in Atlanta. And so a lot of our colleagues have been doing that. It's been small, and we want to increase it, but it takes time to mature a resident and a family to come through a program to build their credit back and so forth. And we always encourage a home ownership. I mean, we can do it all day, every day. We would do it more often, and I'm pretty sure my colleagues can agree with me on that.
I would just say he's right on point. That's most of the time, getting them to the point where they are able to purchase and qualify for mortgages. We've actually bought 10 lots. We're going to build houses at cost to make sure that the voucher can go as far as it can with affordability for those families that we do get ready. But we're only the handyman that can work with the tools that are in our toolbox. Those tools are limited. So that's all I'll say.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to be able to submit questions to you. I have some follow-up questions about qualifying for mortgages and so forth. Thank you so much.
Without objection, the gentlewoman's time has expired. At this time, we recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for participating today. For those who work directly in this industry, I think you have some of the most difficult jobs in the country, frankly. As Mr. Heck articulated, I think quite well, there is a housing supply crisis. We don't have anywhere near the number of homes being built today. And of course, it's been true for generations of Americans that having access to affordable starter homes that you can own and build equity is something that allows families to build wealth, generational wealth, and really get off on the right footing. That being said, and I've heard that, Ms. Tlaib mentioned it as well, homeownership being a key pillar. It is odd to me that there's a big push towards more public housing defined in the narrow sense that Mr. Stile defined it as, because of course you don't own those. Those are owned by housing authorities. And so I think if our goal is homeownership, to promote more spending on items that by their very nature do not lead to home ownership of that specific unit, I think is misguided. And so I guess my first question would be to Mr. Jones. I think you've obviously been around different cities and have seen different programs work, some better than others. I'd like you to speak specifically about how we can get more out of the RAD program. What can we do to make sure that the RAD program or other programs would be more successful when it comes to encouraging the end of homelessness, but also home ownership?
I think the way to encourage more, the RAD program to expand a little bit is to listen to the people who are at this table who run these housing agencies to look at some of the pitfalls from it. RAD is not turned over tomorrow. You know, if you submit a RAD application, it takes a while, and the cumbersome of the paperwork and so forth. But once it's done and so forth, then the action starts. I think it's more of a mentor.
How long does that paperwork typically take?
It just depends. Sometimes you may not submit that right piece of paper and you have to start all over again, or you have to amend it and so forth. So HUD does work with you diligently because they know it's a matter of urgency that you're doing something right, because everything's financed and everything's ready to close and so forth. And so it's a matter of urgency. But how can we streamline it and make it quicker, to make it very appropriate? Looking at the guidelines, does it fit? Does it actually fit your needs and so forth? And if it doesn't, what's your alternative and so forth? And listening to the lay people who do this work every day, I think that will start the better suggestions about how we can improve that program, how we can get more invested in it. The issue is that a lot of agencies don't understand the RAD program. They don't have the capacity to do it, and then they lean themselves over our trade associations, NARO, FADA, and CLAFA. They do a tremendous job and so forth, but to be there right next to them, holding that executive director's hand to show them the pluses and the minuses of the program is much needed also.
And it sounds like HUD could do a better job in that regard as well. Would you agree?
Yes.
And from both a streamlining, but also working with the agencies themselves.
They've been working diligently, but it's not perfect.
Right, absolutely. And then just shifting gears a little bit, Ohio, where I'm from, we have 2 cities that are participating in HUD's Envision Center demonstration program that's designed to streamline government services and help more Americans become self-sufficient, sort of what we were just talking about. Do you or anybody on the panel have feedback on this program to date, and what else we can do in that front? Mr. Collins?
I think we're pretty close based on the Secretary's office to being designated an Envision Center. But the only thing I would say that I would add is it doesn't come with funding right now, so you have to pool sources for funding. So I would think that at some point, it may need to be looked at to figure out how you can appropriately fund what the mission of the Envision Center is.
Great. And with that, I want to thank the panel again. You all are doing incredible work, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Ohio yields back. I want to thank Mr. Gonzalez for your line of questioning and your participation in this hearing, as well as thank the entire panel for your participation today to help inform us, the policymakers. I think this has been quite an eye-opening experience for us to get your testimony on the record in order for us to advise the agency on how they could move forward more efficiently and more proficiently on this issue. So thank you all very much at this. And I'd like to thank our witnesses again for your testimony. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. This hearing is adjourned.